Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the U.S.-China Relations panel of the 2021 Michigan-China Forum. Michigan-China Forum is a non-biased and innovative platform whose diverse ideas and perspectives could be inspired, emerged, and shared. This multicultural celebration is officially registered at the University of Michigan and is organized by a group of driven University of Michigan students across several disciplines. Our discussion today will focus on the power alternation of the United States and the trend of U.S.-China relations surrounding the RCEP agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and corresponding potential. It is our honor to welcome four distinguished scholars from different institutions to share their insights about the U.S.-China relationship. We have Professor Ross. Is Professor Ross here? I'm not sure he has arrived yet. Professor Ross will be joining us, I hope, from Boston College. He currently works as a member of the executive committee of the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. We have Professor Lu Xiankun. He is here. I saw him talk to him earlier. Former senior trade diplomat of China and now managing director of LEDECO, I don't know if I'm supposed to say it as a word, which is in Geneva. Are you joining us from Geneva?
Yes, I'm in Geneva.
Oh my goodness. So it's you're in the middle of the morning, or I don't know, 3 a.m. there, 4 a.m.?
1 a.m.
1 a.m. Okay, well, that's still pretty difficult. We have Mr. Sean Randolph, who I see there. He's the senior director of the Bay Area Council Economic Institute. He's in another time zone, but much more comfortable one, I presume. I assume you're in Pacific time. Is that right?
I am. It's much better.
And we have Professor Peter Petri. He's the Carl Shapiro Professor of International Finance. International Finance, I think of you as a trade guy, okay, in the Brandeis International Business School. For the audience, I want to say if you have questions related to the panel topics, please send your questions in the Q&A, which I see it there. We do have a Q&A and the Q&A section of the Zoom interface. And our panelists may answer these questions if there's time after the round of discussion, if time permits. Before we move on, however, to the panel discussion, let's take 3 minutes to watch a short video about the background about RCEP. Okay, well, there's your introduction to RCEP, as well as a little bit about the role that the United States has and has not played. Now, we have an assigned list of questions here, which I think our panelists have seen. I'm glad to see Professor Ross made it in just after just after I introduced you to the panel, but that's fine. And actually, my first question that I'm going to ask is going to go first to Professor Ross and then to Professor Lu. And the question is, what does the completion of RCEP mean to the Chinese government's trade strategy in Asia? I'd like Professor Ross to speak briefly about that, and then Professor Lu.
I think there are multiple perspectives. I think we need to understand the limits to what RCEP can do for regional trade in terms of volume. The countries all belong to the WTO, and trade barriers are fairly low. So the greatest impact on trade will be a set of common regulations. So the transaction cost will be reduced. And that's an accomplishment. Nowhere near on the scale of the reduction of transaction costs of the European customs zone, but it's not primarily through reduction of tariffs, but primarily through establishment of common regulations for import and exports. In that context, it will help trade, but for China, it has two. But we should understand that China's role as a major trading partner for the region and as the engine of growth, if you will, primarily reflects the size of its market, largest market in the world with 1.4 billion people, and the rate of growth over the last 30, 40 years, averaging 8 or 9% growth, whereas the advanced industrial countries were growing at 2 or 3%. So put those two together, the primary driver of China's role as a regional economy comes from the size of its market and its growth. So the real contribution of RCEP to China's role in the region, I would argue, is a political role. China is taking on leadership. China is the can-do country. China can organize the region, bring them together, and negotiate agreements in which the region feels there is a common interest, a win-win, if you will. And that's something suggested by Wendy Sherman in the lead up in the film to this, that's been lacking in the United States. So whether or not this is a robust example of leadership for free trade, it is standing as the most robust standard for free trade because of its leadership in the absence of other countries. In this respect, the withdrawal of the United States from the regional trade agreement that it negotiated and then withdrew from before submitting it to Congress for ratification was also a political statement. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was not an economic agreement, it was a political agreement. And the US was reestablishing its role as an economic player and a leader in East Asia. Failing to fulfill that, the TPP was a reduction of American leadership and credibility, having a greater impact on politics and economics.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Lu, can you address that same question about the implications for the Chinese government's trade strategy in Asia?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, of course, for the invitation. It's quite an honor to be here with you and Professor Ross on this important issue. For me, the thing about China and its trade strategy in Asia, I think I could maybe characterize in the following aspects. The first one is, of course, we should note that Asia is always the priority region for China in negotiating free trade agreements for the past several decades. The first one China ever signed as a FTA was with ASEAN, and one of the key players in this RCEP. And if you look at the list of 21 FTAs that up to now China has signed, including RCEP, 12 are in Asia. So that means the importance of Asia in China's foreign trade strategy. The second thing is that RCEP, of course, so which means that RCEP will strengthen China's the presence in the Asia as its priority region. The second thing is that it will upgrade China's trade strategy in Asia, because if you look at the details of the RCEP, you will see that many things that was not with China now is the case with China. The first thing is that the ASEAN, which is one of the top trading partner of China, has expanded the tariff-free products coverage to China, included some new sectors like automobiles and components, or motorcycles, chemicals, electronics, and steel products. So these are the strengths of China's export. Of course, it also helped China by adding Japan to the list of Chinese free trade partner. And of course, in many sectors, including equipment, electronics, chemicals, that both countries, China and Japan, will reduce or eliminate the tariff bilaterally. It also consolidated the Chinese trading rules with all RCEP partners on many aspects, so which will reduce the so-called spaghetti bowl, in particular on the rules of origin, which is a highlight of the RCEP. And of course, it will also help China in expanding its imports, which is right now balanced against exports of China, become a kind of a second component of China's strategy, which is helpful. And also it will help consolidate this kind of a global value chain or regional value chain within Asia and Pacific area, and where China is playing a leading role together with Japan and Korea. So if you look at the products traded there, you will see a lot of products are traded come back and forth between RCEP countries, which will, of course, be further consolidated. Services also a highlight where China have made substantial commitments in many sectors, including financial sector, telecommunications, and others, which of course are some of the areas which China didn't do much in the past. And also one highlight of RCEP is that the opening of service sector is done in positive list, but will be transferred into negative list in 6 years' time, so which will provide even greater certainty on that. The last point is that many things, including RCEP or strengthening RCEP, which will be important for China to push its domestic reform, including intellectual property, and e-commerce, competition, government procurement. And government procurement is for the first time that in the FTA China ever signed, and small and prices, so on and so forth. So those I think will be really important for China's presence in Asia in terms of its trade strategy. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I actually have a follow-up question for each of you, and it looks to me like we have time if I'm reading the schedule properly. First, for Professor Lu, my understanding of RCEP is that it includes the countries that the ASEAN group, the 10 Association of Southeast Asian Nations, already had free trade agreements with. It simply put them all together. And in terms of ASEAN's situation, they already had free trade agreements with all of these countries. So this doesn't, I would have thought, change very much. But one of the things you said or implied was that that's actually not true, that the new agreement lowers more tariffs or gets rid of more tariffs than the previous FTAs that were already in existence. And I gather that it also adds a lot of non-tariff provisions, things like coverage of intellectual property. Is that all correct, that this is a much more extensive or inclusive agreement than the ones that these countries already had with the ASEAN countries?
It's difficult to generalize because every participant to RCEP has their own schedules and which are different from the others. So from what I heard, at least for New Zealand, they have no extra market access openings. So for them, the benefits is more consolidation of all these schedules. So as I said, to reduce the spaghetti bowl effect. For China, I think there's not much new market opening, except some by ASEAN in the sector, as I mentioned there. But I think other than this, as you said, non-tariff barriers, intellectual properties, other things actually, even by consolidating them, which means that it will be much easier for any company in RCEP countries to trade among the participants, all the participant countries there. So I think that's something we cannot neglect.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. And Professor Ross, your point that the RCEP is much more a political agreement than an economic agreement, I think I understand in part because there were so many free trade agreements already in place here, although not among China, South Korea, and Japan. But is there more to it in terms of the actual content of the RCEP agreement, the things that are written down? Are there things there that you're referring to when you talk about it being political, or do you simply mean that any kind of an agreement like this involving China is going to be a very political thing? I should mention, I don't think I pointed this out when I introduced you, and you didn't hear it anyway. You are a professor of political science, right? So you're an expert on the politics of this.
Not only economics, on the politics. Thank you. So first, I agree with your prior point that this is not the first multilateral agreement. And CAFTA, the China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, was very extensive in lowering tariffs between China and the 10 ASEAN countries. It was quite successful.
Yeah.
My larger point is that China is already the dominant trade partner and the dominant market for South Korea, for Singapore, for Malaysia, for Thailand, for even Australia. It's the #1 market for Japan. So we've seen China emerge as, if you will, the economic hub of an East Asian regional trade order that's emerging, in much the way the US is the hub for NAFTA, and we might say Germany is the hub for the EU. And that's just a reflection of the size of its market. Now, when we look at the trade flows, many people will comment that more and more of the trade within East Asia is taking place within East Asia. So we're seeing a regional trade agreement, a regional trade system develop. But we shouldn't lose sight that still Thailand doesn't trade with the Philippines and Malaysia doesn't trade much with Vietnam. They're trading with China. And so the trade flows predominantly go back and forth between all the countries in East Asia and China. So that process has been underway for 20 years, since about the year 2000. I've traced that development of China as the market for East Asia, and it's just been growing and it will continue to grow. So in that context, the contribution of RCEP will be at the margins when we think of the importance of China as a market and as an economy for East Asia. But from a political sense, for example, just to take another example, there is the discussion of a code of conduct for the South China Sea. And the code of conduct would involve China and the other members of ASEAN who have interest in the South China Sea. Now, one might think that this is something good if we could have a conflict resolution device among these 10 countries in China. On the other hand, if you're the United States, what you're seeing is China taking a lead in organizing the 10 countries of ASEAN, in organizing a regional order and regional rules, and you're not part of the process. And that's a political outcome that makes the United States reluctant to support something where China's taking the lead. And I think as much as this is an economic agreement, we should see RCEP in that perspective as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Turning now to a similar question, but I'm going to address this to Mr. Randolph first and then Professor Petri. They told me this order, Peter. That's why you're last. I don't know why they chose you as last, but anyway. And the question is basically the same, but for the United States. That is, what does the completion of RCEP mean to the American government and its trade strategies in Asia? So, Mr. Randolph? Turn on your mic.
Good idea, thanks. Yes, I think when RCEP first developed, even though it had its roots in ASEAN, it was perceived by the US government as essentially a Chinese vehicle at the end of the day. As Professor Ross was saying, this is one in which we were not participating, which almost by definition meant that it raised some potential issues for the US in the region. Now, the fact is that, as Professor Ross also said, the US has been or was for many years the #1 trading partner for most of Asia. It's now the #2 for most of Asia, although it's obviously an enormously important trading partner in its own right. And that's not changing a lot, and that's not really going to be impacted, at least in the near to medium term, I don't think, very much by RCEP. But it is certainly a geostrategic question for the US that connects into the trade picture. And there I would go back to pointing to what happened with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an agreement that really came from the US. That was our vehicle. We were really pushing that, and it was negotiated, as was RCEP, in parallel over many years, quite painstakingly. And I think it both served economic purposes and political purposes as well, because these were essentially market economies, and this was a way, essentially, for U.S. values in trade and U.S. standards to be kind of harmonized to a greater degree throughout the region. It was also a much more ambitious agreement than RCEP. RCEP obviously opens certain things up. It addresses tariffs, but TPP went much farther in intellectual property, addressing issues such as the free movement of data across borders, and you can't localize data within your own boundaries, and certain principles like that are really important to our companies, especially technology companies, and with so many U.S. companies really doing business on the basis of the IP that they generate. So when the U.S. withdrew shortly after President Trump took office 4 years ago from the TPP, it wasn't a total shock, because he'd been saying pretty negative things about it during the prior election campaign. But the fact that it was one of the first things he did when he came into office against the requests of most of the partners, that was quite a statement. And it caused difficulty for a number of the partners, one of them being Japan, where Prime Minister Abe had really put a lot on the line to get the agreement. And the US had achieved certain things like opening of Japan's agricultural market. It had been seeking for years. It was a big disappointment in Vietnam, where, as trade agreements often do, the government was looking to use this to leverage certain kinds of economic reforms in Vietnam. So I think the withdrawal was an economic statement, but it also was a political statement about kind of the reliability of the US as a political and a trading partner, which did create, by definition, a void and an opportunity for China. Now, it was really fascinating that the other partners said, well, we're going to go ahead without the US. And obviously the agreement, the CPTPP, as it's now called, really led by in its reformulation by Canada and to a degree Japan. Yet, I think they saw the value in the agreement even without the US. So it's not as consequential as it was, but it is still consequential. And I think the question now for the US coming back in, you have the RCEP model out there. Obviously, China is at the center of that. Not as impactful in its economic applications as CPTPP. And will the US come back to CPTPP? The Biden administration, or rather during the campaign and the transition, the Biden administration or team said, we're not going to consider any new trade agreements for at least 100 days and maybe beyond, because they're very disciplined about the issues they want to address. It's COVID, it's infrastructure, maybe other things. But I think they may not have the luxury of putting trade off all that long. Things are moving without the US. And I think given the differences with China that are not easing at the moment, and that's another whole topic. And the fact that the US will probably need to get through Congress, the administration, an extension of trade promotion authority if it doesn't move quickly. I think what the Biden administration chooses to do now around CPTPP is going to be very important. And I think just to finish that thought, there's a lot of support in business for the US to come back into it. Most people felt it was a really bad idea to leave it, but it's not like you can just walk in the door. Some of the terms were changed when we left. Some of the things we negotiated for were taken off the table. The door was always left open for the US to come back. And I think we would be welcome back if we chose to, but it's another negotiation. It's not just like adding our name now at the bottom of the page. But I think one way that certainly the US could rebalance the equation in Asia would be earlier than later to rejoin the CPTPP.
Okay, thank you very much. Peter, the same question for you. That is the implications for American government's trade strategies in Asia.
I'd like to add two things. I think Sean covered many of the points that I think are the most critical from the US point of view. But I'd like to make a comment about RCEP, because I think in the discussion so far, we have been underestimating it a bit. I mean, it's true that it's not as strong an agreement as the TPP, now CPTPP, is. And it's also true that it's not going to change the basic equation, which is China is at the center of this East Asian economy. But as Professor Lu, I think, pointed out, it has some very interesting new aspects, most importantly, very good rules for encouraging supply chains in the region, rules of origin in the region, which means that this back and forth to China may not be the best characterization of the trade in the future anymore. In fact, as many industries begin to migrate from China because wages are too high, it may be that we will see a stronger network of regional supply chains established. That obviously is what the other economies would like most. And then the other piece of that I wouldn't undersell is the fact that this isn't just about China. This is about 15 countries, of which, first of all, there are Japan and Korea, very important economies in themselves. And they now have a free trade agreement with China, which they never had jointly before. There was a kind of modest free trade agreement between China and Korea. But the idea of this three countries together in a trade agreement is something very new.
And not with each other also, right? Japan and Korea?
And not with each other. And I think as a Japanese economist once described this is kind of a fig leaf for a Japan-China agreement. And obviously in some sense also for a Japan-Korea agreement, because there's no way that those countries could have found themselves in the same agreement before. So I think I can give you numbers later if there is need for them. I think the numbers are not, I would say they won't turn the tables, but they're significant. I mean, it will generate significant gains throughout the region. Now, getting to the US and your question directly, I agree entirely with Sean that the point is not RCEP. RCEP was going to happen with or without the United States in any case. And it was not intended from the beginning to include the United States. The point is the TPP, which 5 years ago we envisioned as a kind of link to Asia, which would essentially set up an economic framework, which hopefully China too would one day join, and which would create a kind of US rules-based like WTO-like friendly framework. Now that didn't happen. The CPTPP at this point is also a largely Asian-centered agreement with Japan and Southeast Asia playing especially prominent roles. So the United States is at this point sort of divorced from what we saw for a long time as a critical economic partner, which is East Asia. And the place where I disagree with Sean a little bit is I think President Biden is kind of boxed in. On the one hand, the Trump administration has really lowered confidence in the United States throughout the region. So I think the kind of concessions countries were willing to make 5 years ago, they're not willing to make anymore. So I think to some extent, renegotiating the agreement will be tougher than it would have been to stay, far tougher than it would have been to stay in it. The second part of it is that the domestic politics is a lot more negative toward rejoining the CPTPP. Because what happened in those 4 years is that in addition to the Democratic opposition, which was always there from inside Biden's own party, we now have the Republicans more or less lined up as telling him that you can't do this because it's just another way of selling out the American worker. So he has a much tougher time. I would guess it's not a matter of 100 days. It's going to take some big successes at home, perhaps successes that result in a resounding win in the midterm elections, but something like that before he can turn back to looking at trade policy. And I'm not sure, frankly, we don't know this for sure yet, and in fact, we see some evidence to the contrary, whether President Biden himself is all that much a free market president. I mean, he is very concerned with the American worker, is very concerned with the criticism that trade hurts the American worker. So let me stop there. But I think this is a disappointment for the United States, not RCEP in itself, but the idea that this kind of plan of engage with Asia economically is much less viable today than it was 5 years ago.
But if I understand correctly, it's less viable because of the things that have happened here over that 4 years. It's not, the RCEP itself doesn't make it either more or less likely that we would rejoin.
No, RCEP doesn't. However, in those 5 years, the other thing that has happened is, of course, the Chinese economy has done very well.
Yeah.
Asian trade has done very well. So some of the kind of historic trends continued, even though the United States took a big step backward from engagement with Asia.
Okay, my next question was going to be for Professor Ross, but I see he just put up his finger. Sounds like he wants to weigh in on what we've just been talking about. Is that correct? Your mic is off. Turn your mic on. Professor Ross,
Yes.
We can't hear you.
You can ask your question as well, if you wish.
Yeah. Oh, okay. The question is, let's see, where are we here? After the completion of RCEP, what do Chinese economic strategies mean to the other Asian countries?
Well, my comment was to express, the political scientist is expressing agreement with the economist. I agree with much of what you had to say. And I found as a political scientist, your comment that 4 years will make it more difficult for the United States to extract concessions in negotiations. And I think it's absolutely right, not only because American credibility has declined, but because RCEP means that they need less for the United States. They're doing well in their economies. They're trading well with China. So the necessity for this American agreement is not what it was, given this free trade agreement. And so they have a little more leverage than they had before. But as a political scientist, I would still want to stress the role of TPP as a political statement and directed at China, as much as RCEP was a program that excluded the United States. I always found it ironic that part of TPP included agreement on domestic regulations for a level playing field in such issues as child labor or environmental standards. And we were very anxious to bring Vietnam and the Philippines in, and no one in their right mind believed the Philippines and Vietnam were going to come up to international standards on environmental and child labor regulations, but we wanted them in anyway. Whereas China, more advanced than, say, the Philippines, was said to be a long way to go before it could be admitted. The one country that was left out of RCEP by its own decision, and the region decided to move on, was India. And here we simply have an example of the impact of domestic nationalism on foreign trade policy and dealing with China. India's trade with China is very robust. It's very hard to reduce. I think the region would have liked to have brought India in ways that might have been advantageous to India. But the idea of being in a Chinese-led economic agreement in which the barriers to trade with China would have been diminished was simply too much for the Indian political system to bear. So the politics of this is going to make India a less viable actor in the economic realm and in the leadership realm within East Asia than it might have otherwise been. And this is simply another case, whether it's the United States and its inability to deal with TPP and its anti-globalization, whether it's India and nationalism. This is simply domestic politics can lead countries to do things that are anathema to their own national interest. And I think that's the biggest impact, is that India is being excluded, other than the United States, of course, in TPP.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Next question I have here is for Professor Lu. And it says, could we see RCEP as a chance for China to form a reliable and sustainable trade relationship with those Asian countries, the ones that are in the RCEP, I presume?
Yeah, I think for the other Asian countries that RCEP does provide a kind of, as we see, that comprehensive kind of framework that would govern the China's relationship with multiple countries in the region. And of course, we would see that the already a very good relationship, trade and investment between China and these countries will be further strengthened through this. Of course, one thing we have to be mindful is that, for me at least, I think RCEP is not a done issue. It is going to be agreement kind of process leading forward, which means that I think, because as we have said, that RCEP in itself, if you look at tariff reduction, non-tariff barriers, other things, as compared to TPP, it's a lower standards. So which means that it has to be beaten up in the long term, if not immediately, but long-term future, so as to further strengthen that. I think that would provide a lot of opportunities for China and Asian countries, and also, as emphasized by others, that RCEP will provide a kind of opportunity to consolidate the regional supply chain among these countries, including China, Japan, Korea, and others, and that kind of regional division of sector or labor or other things will of course help put China's trade and relationship with these countries in a more sustainable and endurable way in the future. Yeah. Was China's trade relations with these other countries not already pretty strong? I guess I thought it was, that they were trading quite a bit with those Southeast Asian nations. I don't know so much with Korea and Japan, but the Southeast Asian nations, I thought they were. Yeah, they were in terms of figures, growth, and everything. Yeah. But on the other side is that there are many things which are not done through past connections or free trade agreements between China and them. Taking for ASEAN and China, for example, the first, if I remember correctly, the first ASEAN-China free trade agreement was signed with a long list. I think 270 something. They call it a list of exceptions, which means that this long list of products will not be, the tariff will not be reduced or eliminated. And then the second one, they reduced that down to something 100, I don't recall exactly, but there's still a long list there. So on the China side, of course, it's more than ASEAN. It means Australia, Japan, others, where they also demand a lot from China in terms of intellectual property rights, service liberalization, such as financial financing and telecommunication, which China didn't do much in previous FTAs. So all these things means that it was strong, but it needs to be stronger, if I could put it in that way. Okay, thank you very much.
we're actually a little bit ahead of schedule here, which is not a bad thing, because we could maybe end up with more time at the, oh, I see Peter has his hand up. Yes, Peter.
Yeah, just let me add a quick reinforcing point for what Professor Lu is saying. Is one of the characteristics of ASEAN-centered arrangements, and this really is ASEAN-centered in the sense that the leadership is kind of sitting within ASEAN, not in China. Now, China is the most important economy in the agreement, but you still have to get 14 other economies to agree, and they have a voice. And one of the interesting things about those agreements is that they improve over time. The ASEAN Free Trade Agreement began with 5 countries with very simple sector-specific arrangements, and it is now a fairly comprehensive among the 10 ASEAN countries themselves. It's now a fairly comprehensive, almost European-like union. That's overstating it, but the point that I wanted to make, and RCEP has these provisions too, is provisions that say we will look at this again. And if we can agree on more, we'll improve it. And this has happened repeatedly, including in the ASEAN +1 agreements, which they have concluded with outside partners. So this is not just a dream. This is actually the way, if things work out well, this is what you'd expect.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Robert?
I want to piggyback on Professor Petri's comments. One of the reasons that CAFTA, the China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, was so successful is that China played the role in an East Asian trade agreement similar to the role the United States played in reaching the GATT agreement after World War II. Dominant economy, very confident, was able to give non-reciprocal concessions to the smaller states so that they saw a very large advantage to reaching the agreement. And because the Chinese economy was so large, the impact of non-reciprocity on their own economic fate was minimal, much the way the United States dealt with Western Europe when their economies were collapsing after World War II. And so they're playing that great power role of the hegemon offering cooperation. And certainly the early harvest, the first 4 years of the CAFTA agreement, were essential in getting the ASEAN countries to sign on and see the benefit. Now, I haven't looked carefully at RCEP, but I wouldn't be surprised if China made certain concessions in order to bring along the other countries, and in so doing, reach an agreement for the region, and if you will, forgive me, steal a march on the United States.
That's very interesting. I wonder if anybody knows if there was an extent to which RCEP is less than fully reciprocal, I guess, between China and the others. Are the other countries allowed to exclude more products, for example, than China is?
I think the issue is not that, is that the things that they want to protect, China said that's okay, you can protect that.
And China isn't doing the same thing themselves.
Whereas they open their market to things that the ASEAN countries would benefit from exports. So there's it will contribute more to ASEAN exports to China than Chinese exports to ASEAN.
Interesting.
And that imbalance may be part of the reason for success. Certainly was for CAFTA. I don't know about RCEP.
I saw Xiankun raise the figure. Yes.
Yeah, no, I just want to compliment to what already said by other speakers, which I agree. The thing is about this less than reciprocity is, of course, something important, but in real negotiation, it's just a concept, right? And which has to be translated into real kind of schedules, concessions, commitments, so on and so forth. So what I heard from the negotiators of RCEP is that it's very much specific to each country. So there you don't really talk about reciprocity. You really talk about a kind of offer, request and offer process. So which means that ASEAN country may come to China and say that I want you to open this and that, and reduce this and that. And China would do the same, others would do the same. So based on that, it's really become a kind of very specific, non-reciprocal kind of concessions by each and everyone. Generally speaking, I do see that like the very vulnerable small countries in ASEAN, some of them are even LDCs, they were allowed to do less than others. But it was not really a kind of stringent adherence to the reciprocity or less than non-reciprocity. It's just based on the reality, bilateral negotiations, plurilateral, and all the group like that. Yeah.
But I think that actually reinforces the point that Robert made, because that's what it sounded like after World War II, I think, between the U.S. and other countries. Yeah, very interesting. Okay, well, we're no longer ahead of schedule. Let me move on to the next question I had here, which is going to be for Professor Lu, followed by Professor Ross. It's a slightly longer question. RCEP includes members with different economic systems, ideologies, and political influences on the global stage. If there are potential risks, what measures should China use to address these disparities among the countries? Professor Lu?
Yeah, I think this is something we discuss a lot here in Geneva. So this is a question actually not only between China and other RCEP countries. It is also a high on the agenda question for China and US. It is also becomes a high on the agenda issue for the WTO. The basic thing to start with, as you said, is the systemic difference between China and most other countries, both political and economic. And China is just unique as it is now, and it's a reality for everyone, including US, other RCEP countries, Asian countries, and all the other WTO members have to face. The thing is how to deal with that. I think they are tough questions for many countries to answer, especially for US and other RCEP countries. Is that how do you deal with such a systemic difference, and how do you avoid a kind of risk which is created by such a systemic difference if you don't manage it well? The thing for me, it is that the key question for the US and other countries to answer is that, would you allow coexistence of a different system, both political and economic? We discuss here, and at least some of us think that if you want to force a convergence of different systems, if you impose on China what it doesn't have now, it creates tensions, it creates conflicts, it creates many problems that will kill not only bilateral trade collaboration between China and others, but also on the multilateral collaboration among all WTO members. Of course, the key question, and also a very tough question for China, is that how to recognize the difference there, both political and economic, and how will China continue to reform its political and economic system, especially on how to manage the spilling over effects of that difference that would seen by others would undermine their interests and create an unlevel playing field, and so on and so forth. So I think if we go along this way, trying to find answers to these very tough questions, I think then we have a clearer path forward on this. Otherwise, I think this is going to be stuck, be blocking a lot of other things, including trade and investment collaboration, both bilaterally and regionally and multilaterally in the long-term future. I will stop here.
Okay, I turn next to Professor Ross, who I saw was nodding. So yes, what do you have to say?
I can be a bobble doll sometimes. Very important questions and important points raised by Professor Lu. The issue of the disparity in economic level among the countries and the issue of different political systems. I refer to Professor Petri, and I'm sure he's aware of the great work by Albert Hirschman, National Power and the Structure of Foreign Trade. And the point that Albert Hirschman made in that book is that large markets can use their markets to create economic dependency and therefore political dependency on the part of smaller countries, and therefore have greater power over smaller countries. So that the issue of something referred to earlier, the disparity in economic levels is something of an advantage for China to make these concessions to enable them to protect themselves and export to China, and thereby China can create that dependency on those countries and minimal cost to their economy. Now, the issue of politics came up, and there are 2 points there. One is that if you take a look at the American system and the politics in our system, you might think it's to the advantage of the United States to reach a free trade agreement with Taiwan, so as to reduce Taiwan's dependency on mainland China. But there's one problem. Taiwan is very conservative about allowing American pork into Taiwan because of the presence of steroids in American pigs. And the United States, because its political system says, you let those pigs in or we won't have a free trade agreement, because there are enough members in Congress who have an interest in pig exports that can block it. China does not have that problem. They don't have to ratify this through an independent legislature. So they can make these concessions to these smaller countries in order to enhance their political relationship with these countries. Now, the issue of political systems, it's an American conceit that says all our friends around the country have our political system and China doesn't. The countries in East Asia have a wide variety of government interference in the economy. Now, China might be more than most, but certainly we're all familiar with the South Korean chaebols, or the extent to which the Japanese interfere in investment regulations in their economy. So as much as it chagrins me to say, the World Bank, in ranking free trade economies last year, placed Japan and China as more free than the United States. So that, 4 years of protectionism will do that. So having said that, the point is that these countries are going to reach agreements with each other that are in their economic interests, despite having a wide variety of different kinds of economic systems and political systems that are very different than the American system. And certainly that hasn't prevented Europe from reaching a potentially consequential investment treaty with China, despite the human rights situation in China, despite the political systems are different. Countries are going to negotiate. If they can reach an advantageous agreement, they'll do so.
Well, thank you. Sean, you had your hand up there. Do you want to have something you wanted to contribute?
I was going to add to Professor Lu's point, this question about, can the two different systems coexist? And I think this may not really affect RCEP so much, but on a global scale, if you look at it maybe through a WTO lens, I think part of the issue the US and other countries have with China now traces back to a broad question about whether or not China is adequately in compliance with the obligations it made on entering the WTO. And I think you can debate technically whether they're out of compliance or not, but there's a lot of people who believe that, at least in spirit, that there were commitments made that they would have state-owned enterprises, but that they would act independently and not under government direction. They would act as commercial vehicles, and you would have intellectual property protection and equal market access and a variety of principles that were actually formally signed onto. And I think part of the issue we're looking at today in a global context is a debate about whether, as China is moving more in a state-led direction in its economy, with the party playing a stronger role than in the past, and to some degree bringing private enterprises to heel around state objectives, and then with the fact that state-owned enterprises, contrary to what many thought 20 years ago, were not being moved aside or phased out, but in fact growing in importance as are subsidies. Is that compatible with the WTO obligations? And so, kill that. Anyway, where it goes in the WTO, I think Professor Lu will have a much better idea than I do, but one way that people may think is, well, do economies that actually do more fully operate, and nobody's perfect, by market principles, undertake their own initiatives, their own agreements? Can you do that within a WTO context? But I think there are, in fact, systemic differences between what's happening in China that are qualitatively different than what you find in most Western economies and to a lesser degree in parts of East Asia, that it at least raises issues about how those differences actually are reflected or dealt with in multilateral trade agreements. I think everybody wants to expand the trade, but when you get to the role of government subsidies and the degree to which different sectors are opened or not, I think there's more acknowledgement in the past that there are in fact significant systemic differences.
Okay, thank you. Robert? Your microphone's off. Yeah.
This is an important point. It's not, as Dr. Randolph said, it's not really an RCEP point, but there are various areas in which China has unilateral unfair advantages, if you will. There are domestic investment laws and joint venture laws, the support for the state-owned enterprises, and the lax enforcement of intellectual property rights, for example. And much of this is incompatible with the norms of the advanced industrial countries. The problem we have is that solution of this is not a WTO regulatory process. It's a political process. And China likes its system. It likes its state-owned enterprises. It likes its investment laws that compel foreign companies to share technology or not participate in the Chinese economy. That's a choice they have to make because of the investment laws. And so the question we have to ask is, do the advanced industrial countries have the leverage to compel China to change? And the answer is sadly no. That is that I think Europe has made clear that they stumble over each other and try and outrace the United States to get unilateral advantage with China. And they certainly stabbed the Biden administration in the back with that investment treaty. And they knew they were doing that, but there was an advantage in reaching that agreement. And with the Chinese economy being as large as it is and growing as fast as it is, and having, if you will, doing better in the trade war than the United States, they will call countries bluffs and say, what are you going to do? We like our system. So I think the challenge for the WTO and Dr. Randolph's concerns are, can we find ways to maintain global international economic stability without significant change in Chinese behavior? And that requires some degree of tolerance of the other countries of China's behavior so they don't start global trade wars.
I see Professor Lu raised a finger.
9 p.m.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to compliment to what has been said. I mean, we are combining the difference of system, China's accession to the WTO, whether China has honored its commitments in accession, and where are the new problems come from, and whether can we regulate them in the WTO or outside of the WTO. I just want to put these things together just to throw out a few things. I think the first question about China's accession to the WTO and whether China honored its commitments, I know there's a different view in the US and in China and elsewhere. For me, as a former negotiator on behalf of China on the WTO, I would say there are two kinds of, at least in different people's eyes, two kinds of commitments, okay? The first one is what I would call kind of specific, really read into text commitments. It means about China's reduction of tariffs by how much, China's elimination of non-tariff barriers on where and how and when, and whether China liberalizes its service in this sector and that sector, how and when. For this, China has almost 100% done it. There are some ambiguities, different views, and the US brought China to WTO. China lost and China corrected. So that's one thing. The second kind of commitments in the eyes of the US and others is more something, I would say, something hidden behind the lines. okay, of the tax. So something say that China committed to go into the market-driven direction, and China would, reduce or stop government intervention into the economy. So that's a more kind of something conceptual. It's not specifically translated into specific commitments like you have done, like you have asked China to do on tariffs and so on and so forth. Because in the WTO, there's no definition about what is market economy and what is not market economy. There's no criteria, nothing. And also about state-owned end prices, in WTO, there's no specific provision except the so-called state trading end prices. There's no definition on state-owned end prices. So for me, these are the things really arguable. And that's where I think the thing is that, can we deal with it in the WTO or not? I think that, yes, we can. But we have to make sure that everybody sit down at the negotiating table, trying to negotiate new rules on these things and other things, of course. But what Trump has done is totally opposite. Trump just neglected the WTO and brought China into bilateral table and imposed through this phase one agreement, asking China to do this and that. And then the funny thing there is that Trump asked China to buy more from the US, okay? And then what China did, China bought more through state-owned enterprises. And that's kind of seen in many other WTO members. It's more government intervention than less government intervention. So Trump created more problems by trying to resolve the problem. So I think that's something we have to avoid. Of course, to conclude, what I want to say is that you cannot just in the WTO negotiate only China issues, state-owned enterprises, RPR, and others. There have to be a balance of interest. For example, the US, long-standing issue of domestic support, the agricultural subsidies, and which is criticized by many others. How do we deal with them? So I think you need to put a lot of issues together and trying to negotiate on that. And one last point on the forced technology transfer. I just want to correct probably one misunderstanding by Professor Ross, is that in the latest Chinese new investment law, China put there specifically, I forgot which article, saying that Chinese governments will not force technology transfer by foreign companies. Okay, so that's already a new commitment, a new regulation, new provision in Chinese investment law to avoid that kind of thing. So I think that's already something very clear. Yeah.
Okay, it looks like Robert wants to respond. You need to turn on your mic first.
Just a quick response to that. I didn't say that China forces countries to turn over intellectual property. I said that because there is a 50% ownership requirement for domestic firms, the negotiating leverage lies with Chinese firms to say, give us your technology or you cannot invest in China. And so the choice is up to American firms. No one's forcing them to. But because of the structure of the legal system, they have a choice. They don't have an equal negotiating field, a level playing field. That doesn't exist in the United States. That doesn't exist in Europe. It doesn't exist in any advanced industrial country. But two other quick thoughts. One is we do have the debate with China over whether China has a developing economy status. And we have this endless debate over whether we measure this from per capita income or GDP. And certainly it's the second largest economy in the world based upon GDP. It's hard to sustain a developing country status. But the other issue is more complicated. And that is something we faced with Japan back in the 80s and 90s. And that is what we call non-tariff barriers. And non-tariff barriers exist in China. And this is much like Japanese companies prefer to buy from Japanese companies, and they'll have vertical integration. And at the local level, county governments will buy from county factories. And this is a much more difficult problem to deal with. And I fear that's probably irresolvable. but that's a major contribution to the frustration that foreign companies have in dealing with China.
Can I just ask Professor Lu, the 50% requirement, I thought I had heard that China was dropping that. Is that not correct?
I think, yeah, maybe. I think that's a very important issue. I think Professor Ross was right in saying that when China joined the WTO, there was a kind of commitments by China to open its markets, okay? But just like many other countries have done in their accession negotiations, that you don't immediately fully open everything, right? You have to do it in an incremental process. So that's where these 50% or other kind of things come in. So in some sectors like automobile and others, they did exist this kind of 50% ownership requirement on some of these sectors, and that's where actually it's not Chinese governments, like Professor Ross said, that it's more than when you need to find a partner in China for that extra 50%, and then that company has a leverage, saying that, okay, I can do it with you, but give me your technology. But this is not government intervention by China or Chinese legal system. It's more like a kind of natural result of accession commitments which US and EU and others agreed. So that's the first one. Second one, to answer to your question, yes, 50% in automobile and a few other sectors have been recently released through unilateral concession China did through domestic kind of new reform, like the Hainan free trade pilot zone and all this. So that's where China let go of this. So that's not the issue anymore. But of course,
that's just a few sectors, or more generally, is investment now possible across the board, 100%?
Sector by
no,
sector.
no, it's not 100%. It's just a few, how to say, kind of hot sectors where the EU, US are really are targeting China. Oh. But as I say, coming back to what I want to say to conclude my intervention is that this is what the US and the EU and others agreed that China could do this. Now you feel it's not good anymore for many reasons. How to do it? Come back to WTO, restart a new negotiation. You ask China to do this, China will ask you to do that, and then do it. I think that's the way out of it. Yeah.
Well, of course, coming back to the WTO at this point, after some of the things that has happened to the WTO, partly by Mr. Trump, it's not as viable as it once was, although that's, I guess, where you are sitting. But I hope it's going to be better in the future, but it's had some problems. We've gotten way off topic here, but I like this discussion. I think we've gotten into some very good issues, so I'm not going to worry about that. I do want to hear, I haven't heard from Professor Petri about these topics that we've just been talking about. I don't know if he has something he wants to contribute on this.
Yes, of course. It's a very interesting discussion. The part that I think is changing is that, first of all, China has been remarkably successful with its strategy of keeping some, and not a lot. I mean, 70% of the Chinese economy is not government-owned enterprises. It's 30% that is government-owned enterprises. But China has been in some areas remarkably successful at keeping these kind of beasts alive, which by all Western economy standards should have collapsed under their own weight. And in the meantime, and this has to do to some extent with big new industries being formed and a lot of investment required, and China had felt, telecommunications, for example, is a big sector where state-owned enterprises are important. Mining, extraction are other sectors. China has felt that in order to move very quickly, it would like to keep control over state-owned enterprises. And all across the world, in fact, state-owned enterprises or industrial policy, which means not necessarily state-owned enterprises, but a fairly large role for government through subsidies and the tools of industrial, are kind of making a comeback. If you look at the Biden $3 trillion investment plan, an important part of that will be supply chain regulation, making sure that supply chains are, if not in the United States, at least among American allies. So there is a lot of incentives for reshoring supply chains. So there is a whole range of policies. And of course, Trump didn't know about industrial policy being bad. So much of his policy was asking for and threatening firms if they didn't bring investment back or behave the way that he hoped that they would. So industrial policy is making something of a comeback. And I don't know how the WTO will deal with this. The United States has a lot of Buy in America regulations now, and is likely to have even more in the future. For some things, if you want to build out very quickly 5G technology in the United States, you're going to have to spend state money. And it was under that banner that I think the United States at one point proposed buying, I don't remember whether it was Nokia or Ericsson or both of them, as a way to create a competitor to Huawei. So it's complicated. I mean, maybe for some kinds of applications, industrial policy works. Certainly in the green energy sector, there will be a lot of subsidies necessary for perfectly good reasons. I mean, these are externalities that need to be corrected, and the government will be the only source of those corrections. So I think we're facing a very murky world. China is obviously taking advantage of its state-owned linkages to state-owned enterprises for a wide variety of reasons, including international competition. But some of it may actually work. So I just wanted to add that, because as we transition into the next part of this discussion, where we think about what the United States is going to try to do or should do, I have a feeling that industrial policy will play a significant role in that, whether we as economists like it or not. And I'm not sold, by the way. I'm just raising this as an issue.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And you've just led into what was to be our next topic, even though we're a bit behind schedule here. But and it was a question that was going to come to you first, Peter, and then to Mr. Randolph. And it is this: what kinds of struggles will the Biden administration face if it wants to get back to the Asian Pacific trade area in the future? And what reception will the U.S. get from those countries if it tries to move in that direction? So what do you think the U.S. ought to be, under Biden, ought to be doing?
Well, yes, I mean, and I think other speakers already referred to this. The issue is not RCEP, but the issue is the CPTPP and whether the United States could rejoin. And there are a lot of reasons, both geopolitical and economic, why we should rejoin. So I think the issue there is simply one of politics, whether the US politics will permit that to happen. And the other side of it is, under what terms would the United States like to rejoin? One thing that is likely to happen, and I think this would be very interesting and would make it even more necessary for the US to rejoin, is if other economies, for example, South Korea or Indonesia or Thailand, all of which have expressed interest in the CPTPP, were to join. I mean, then it would begin to look like a larger Pan-Asian enterprise, which would be very difficult for the US to stay out of. So I have a sense that there will be a lot of pressure eventually on the US administrations. And maybe if we can solve this kind of internal question of a lot of people feeling that they are not keeping up with the economy's overall progress, maybe if Biden can do something about that through the investments that he's making now and will be making through the Build Back America plan, maybe he'll be in a position of saying, now we're very strong, now we're ready to engage with the world fully again. But that, I think, is not to be taken for granted and is not going to happen very quickly. There will be negotiations. I mean, one of the issues, one of the things the other 11 countries left aside were many of the intellectual property issues. They felt that some of them were forced on them by the United States. Why should an author get royalties for 99 years after he's dead? A series of issues which seemed like the serving the interest of a very copyright and patent-rich country. Similarly on pharmaceuticals, and I wonder what the COVID crisis will do to that, because I think the COVID crisis will not make it easier for countries to demand very strict ownership rights to inventions that may have great world benefits. So there will be some difficult discussions, but I would guess that one way or another, a well-meaning administration can solve that if it wants to re-enter the Asian trading system. And I think the United States should want to do that, even if it will be number 2 or maybe number 3 eventually in many of those markets. I think participating would add to the stability of that part of the world. And I think it would add to the dynamism of the US economy. That's going to be a very rapidly growing, large economy, perhaps the largest economy, and perhaps the most rapidly growing part of the world economy over the next few decades.
Which, of course, was, I think, the reason why President Obama wanted to do. He was not a great free trader, but he became persuaded that the TPP was something we had to be part of. Sean, do you have something on this topic?
Yeah, I agree with Peter. I think that the most impactful direct way back, at least into this sort of multilateral regional leadership role, would be through joining the CPTPP. I think the pharmaceutical question that Peter raised is maybe one of the stickier ones, but none of that is insurmountable. I think one of the challenges will be, again, I think they would like us back in, but they're just not going to roll over the existing parties and say, hey, whatever you want to the United States. And I think we said earlier in the program that our leverage is maybe diminished now from what it was 4 years ago. But I think President Biden will have his own challenges coming in. There are very strong progressive voices now in the new administration, and there have always been priorities in the Democratic Party when different presidents have come in around environmental standards and labor, and those things have gotten baked into new agreements more and more, including the USMCA with Mexico and Canada. But I was a little bit involved in the trade policy team during the campaign, and it was quite clear then and clearer now that, for example, climate change is going to be baked into everything that the administration does internationally and a lot domestically, including infrastructure investment. And so there may be new priorities and new issues that the US is going to push on the table now if it wants to rejoin that it was not moving as strongly before. So I think there's a discussion out there for sure. I think also this kind of relates to the broader question of the role of the US in the region. I just finishing the trade point. It's good to keep in mind that some of these agreements were launched under Republicans, but Democratic presidents put them through. It was really Bill Clinton who got got NAFTA through, and President Obama was able to get things through that his predecessor couldn't do. So I think it is within the ability of even liberal Democratic administrations to move these issues if they choose to. And I think one motivation that may be stronger now than it was 4 or 5 years ago is that I think strategically, and this is a bipartisan perspective in Washington, that China is seen as, I don't want to use the word adversary, some would say that, but more of a strategic competitor. And people look at what's happening in the South China Sea, and they're seeing what's happening with Hong Kong and a variety of things. You can kind of wrap RCEP into that and tucking it into a corner. And I think there's more of a consensus forming that the United States needs to much more seriously address the competitive issues that China is posing both economically and perhaps strategically. So if you drop that onto the map in the Asia Pacific area, that actually increases the incentive for the US to come back into agreements like CPTPP and to exert or re-exert its influence, not just strategically, as it undoubtedly will do, but economically as well.
Okay, I see Robert raising his hand, and my next question was going to go to him. So you can say what you were going to say, but also then move into this next topic, which is what does the very dramatic change in attitudes that have occurred in America and in the American government in recent years towards foreign trade, what's happened in 2017 and now again in 2021. What does that mean for our dealings with China and the other Asian countries? Need your microphone.
So I agree that an incentive to make the difficult decisions to join the CPTPP could be premised on competing with China in Asia. But this is emerging as a rationale for a host of issues. How will we sell infrastructure spending? It will be a Cold War narrative competing with China. How should we join? We need to join the CPTPP. Why? Because of the China threat in Asia, and we must compete. So at some point, we have to think about how we balance these competitive American interests. Do we want to crank up the American system to move China from competitor to adversary to enemy in order to achieve these other interests? And my fear is that the more we pile on China as a rationale for a host of policies the administration might want, the more the relationship with China will go south to the detriment of other interests. But I agree also with my colleagues that the American political system is just not prepared to make the difficult decisions necessary to have congressional ratification, 51 votes on a trade agreement in which, as Peter was saying, we have our populist Republicans and our progressive Democrats are just going to make this extremely difficult. And the answer to this over the longer term, as President Biden keeps saying, is to put our house in order. And if we can establish a healthier economy with much more robust growth, that will do far more to increasing our economic and political presence in Asia than an agreement. And it will make an agreement easier to reach because the region will want to cooperate with us more. All this is, it's easier said than done, but one cannot help but be depressed at the state of the American political system right now and its ability to make difficult decisions, whether it's a dysfunctional relationship between the president and Congress, whether it's race relations, whether it's the deficit, whether it's the inability to raise taxes, the list goes on. And somehow, until we can get some sort of consensus in what's needed to be done, nothing's going to get done in Asia. And anything we do get done in Asia will only work at the margins if we can't get our house in order.
Okay, well, that's encouraging. I'm being sarcastic, of course. Professor Lu, this question was to go to you as well, how the changing attitudes in the United States are going to affect all of this.
Yeah, I think any free trade agreements by different countries has an element of competition. The simple thing is that when you sign a free trade agreement, let's say with Japan, with whom I don't have, which means that you have more advantages in Japanese market than I do, because tariff is lower, non-tariff barriers are gone, and so on and so forth. So, but that's more like kind of trade perspective, and which is reasonable, natural, okay? But as Professor Rose said that, but if you play too much geopolitical consideration, by piling upon too many other things, and trying to do this in a geopolitical way, and it complicates things. It means that you do this simply trying to isolate the other, and this become a zero-sum game, and which will be detrimental for not only China and the US, but also for other trading partners in Asia. So coming back to your question about how China should respond to this, I think as simple is that Trump may have a geopolitical lens to look at this. Biden, we don't know yet, but China should not do this. I think Asia is big enough, and US is never away from Asia Pacific. It's always the central player there, and this kind of free trade agreements actually is a natural thing. Even under the WTO system, WTO allows, under Article 24 of GATT and Article 5 of GATT, allows members to enhance closer relationship through free trade agreements. So I think China should let everyone play their role, trying to sign this, sign all of this. The other thing is that, of course, the Biden administration, the change of attitude. As I said, we don't know whether this attitude of change will lead to a change of mindset, the geopolitical lens. That's what we need to wait and see. For me, if you look at the Asia Pacific area, you would see that there are many things going on there. You have ASEP, you have TPP, and you in Asia on the APEC. There's only one. There's also one initiative. It's called FTAAP. So it's a free trade agreement among all the 20 also APEC members. And then in the WTO, I'm a WTO expert, so I always bring everything back to the WTO. Is that these kind of things created this different kind of all kinds of free trade agreements create a spaghetti bowl effect, which means that any company who wants to trade, investment, they need to look at different free trade agreements, all this kind of, it's very costly for them to respond to comply to them. So the best thing is that FTAP is going to be something, if China even wants to join this TPP, China said that it wants to join, and China already said it wants to join CPTPP. So which means that it consolidates everything through China joining CPTPP, US joining CPTPP, you create a bigger TPP, and you create a bigger FTAP among all APEC members, and ultimately you create more common rules in the WTO. That is the most ideal situation, but of course it's a long-term process. But I think if China looks at that way, if the US Biden administration could also look at in that way, I think it is the best scenario for all of us beyond China and US. Yeah.
Do you really think that China, that President Xi would like to see the US succeed in joining the CPTPP, that thing, or would they be just delighted to see our own disability to do these things keep us locked out of these other markets? Wouldn't they prefer that?
I don't think so. At least what I heard from my former colleagues is really that China doesn't want this to become a zero-sum game, that I want to join this because I want to keep you out. No, at least China didn't want to do the same thing which Trump or others have done, is that I want TPP to isolate China. No, yeah. I think that will be bad for China. For China, a simple thing is that China wants to have a framework where they could govern the China-US relationship, trade and others. So where to do it? WTO is the best way, but it's a long-term process. So CPTPP is already there, and which would provide a ready framework if both China and the US wants to be in. That will be one much easier, probably shorter path. The only thing is that for China, it's easier saying than done, simply because that many provisions in TPP means that very difficult and tough reforms by China in terms of intellectual property, fishery subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and this government intervention, data localization, all this competition. So China needs to do a lot. But when she said that, Chinese president, she said that, I think at least they want to try whether they can live up to that high level. Let's see. I mean, it has to be, we have to see it through real negotiations. Yeah.
Okay, Sean, you had a hand up briefly. Did you want to say something? You're turned off.
Thanks. Just going to support two things that were just said. Robert's point about a lot of things we should be doing politically being sort of wrapped up in a sort of posed in sort of in a China wrapping. And as one example, there's a piece of legislation out there now in Congress called the Endless Frontiers Act, which would basically double US investment in basic science through the National Science Foundation and do other things too. And I think a lot of us would argue that that's something we should do, irrespective of anything else. It's a really good idea. And in terms of competition, the best thing is develop your own strengths, invest in your own assets, don't worry about the other guys too much. But in the Senate, it's being driven by Minority Leader Schumer, who intends to wrap it into a China package. All these things that have to be done to address, the perceived threat from China. And so I would also have some concern that we need to do what we need to do to compete. But if it becomes piling on China too much, that's going to be counterproductive. I think also on Professor Lu's comments about what China would have to do to join the CPTPP, it's a really interesting question because I agree. I don't think we should want to be excluding China from it. But the question that would occur to me is, could China actually conform to its terms? Rigorous IP protection, no data localization. I don't know how China could ever agree to that. The free cross-border movement of data. How could China ever agree to that? And I think the members of CPTPP, I assume, would be really rigorous in requiring agreement and compliance. So for me, it's more of a technical question. Could China in good faith and in fact agree to its principles or its requirements and implement them? So those were just two thoughts.
I'd be happy to hear Professor Lu's response to that. Do you think China could do that or would do that?
To be frank with you, I don't have an answer because I think probably Beijing, my former colleagues have the, to be frank, I don't think they even have the answer. I know they have done some studies looking at each and every, how to say, the provision in TPP that the basic conclusion is that some of them, we can do it. Some others with tough reforms, we can do it. There are a few things probably we cannot do, but let's negotiate. Okay, so taking for example the free flow of data on the e-commerce and all those things. For me, I mean, I'm not how to say want to go to all the details, but for China, the basic thing is that China wants to, how to say, stop the data flow about political things, anti-China, anti-Communist Party, all those things. And in China is blocked and is taken away. Can we do this? I think probably technically we can do. In trade agreements, we means free trade, free flow of data means more kind of commercial data, commercial information, all those things. If we can find a way to divide the two, there may be a way out, but I'm too naive. I don't know. So I don't have the answer, but I think nobody has an answer unless you try through real negotiations. Yeah.
But I think implicit in what you're saying is that the negotiation would be to change somewhat what the current text of the CPTPP says in order to accommodate, to change it in some fashion in order to accommodate, like you say, this separation, to have the rules apply only to commercial but not to political, if that can somehow or other be defined, because it's surely not the way it's written now.
Yeah, I think it is going to has to be the choice of other TPP participants. But I think one example we could use is like Vietnam. Vietnam actually has not the same, but a similar political system as China, and also have state-owned enterprises, government intervention.
Yep.
I do recall that in TPP there is some specific provisions which give a kind of leeway for Vietnam to do differently than others. So that's probably also something we could consider. I don't know. I do not mean everything for China, but at least something really tough political things in a trade agreement. We have to find a way. It has to be. We have to be innovative. We have done this in many things in the past. Even for China, remember when China joined the WTO, in the early years, China would not even allow market economy to be written in Chinese in the accession protocol, but afterwards China just agreed to include it there, but say that I think a similar wording say something market economy with Chinese characteristics, and with some of course specific kind of commitments there. But I think that's just want to say that if we can be innovative, there's always a way out of it.
Well, you're right that when China joined the WTO, it was in a process that was moving more and more over the years towards more market reliance. But in the last decade, it's been moving the other direction. And therefore, I wouldn't myself be so optimistic that they would that President Xi specifically would be willing to make the sorts of changes that the other members of the CPTPP might want. You disagree?
It depends on specific issues. Yeah, but I think even for us, I mean, I'm an independent expert now, so I could say even some of the things which is happening in China, like state-owned enterprises, we don't like it. So I have been saying in China that Chinese reform, for example, on state-owned enterprises, is not going forward; it's going backward. But it doesn't mean that it cannot be reversed, because if you look at all the way back from 1978, when China started this reform process, until now, it's always a little bit kind of up and down, back and forth process. In some years, like in the 90s, China did make tough reforms on state-owned enterprises. Yeah. Afterwards, it went back and it went forward again. So, I mean, you have to put this in the longer history. Don't be misled by what is happening now. I mean, there are many things going on in China. We have an internal debate about whether we should reform further or we should do it differently. This kind of debate has been going on since 1978. So we have to give it a little bit time, see how it goes, and help it, push it, and frame China into the TPP, FTA, WTO, whatever, and then help with that process. I think that's the best way forward.
Okay, that may well work. I'm more pessimistic actually about the United States getting back involved in some of these things. So, Peter, I see your finger, but I also see your.
Yeah, I have a concern that we have, in a way, drifted to the technicalities of international trade. And if there were a kind of high-level concert on we wanted to cooperate and we wanted to make sure that we had common rules and to some extent defend the level playing field, as we often say, I think we probably could find solutions. And it may be, in fact, that something like the TPP or the CPTPP is a better way to find solutions than through the WTO, which has, 150 50 other countries who are involved in the discussion. But I have a concern that what we are really now, what has happened to us over the last 5 years is a sense that this is some kind of higher level strategic contest about technologies which have ultimately a kind of large strategic or military role, and that somehow it's in the interest of both countries to develop those independently and to deny access to those technologies to the other. And in that context, and particularly if people in the security realm have a large voice, as they do, and understandably so in both countries, in that context, it would be very difficult to organize the level of deep interaction which we were approaching 5 years ago. So at some level, the trade issues are a symptom of that. They are not the cause of it, as I think about it. And China is now very committed to developing advanced technologies similar to those, especially those with which it finds itself, in which it has found bottlenecks in terms of some of these key industries. It's very committed to developing those industries. It's probably going to invest a lot of money in them. The state will have a very high role in them. I mean, that's what we have been learning in recent announcements. And in that context, the United States is itself going to take steps to try to divorce supply chains, which might involve high technology products, from being engaged with China. So there is a level at which this is not primarily a trade issue. It's now primarily a strategic competition issue. And if we could somehow, and this is my kind of real hope, if we could somehow turn trade into one of the several positive ways in which we engage each other, and there are others, there are cultural issues, there's education, there are areas of technology in which strategic competition doesn't enter, that might help a soft power competition. I mean, one of the areas in which the United States is quite strong, even now, despite the Trump years, is its ability to project its values or project its culture to other countries. China, despite its great success, hasn't been able to do that. I have a feeling if we had developed a kind of more constructive competition in those areas, in education and technology, we might get past this strategic sense of threat or sense of interaction which is limited to basically zero-sum games instead of positive-sum games. I don't know how to do that, but I don't think trade itself is going to save us. It will be a symptom of our ability to address these problems on another level, on a more strategic level.
Robert, I think you.
Yeah, just briefly, we need to remember that we tried many years ago to negotiate within the WTO, and we failed. The Doha round collapsed.
Mm.
And there were other countries involved, but primarily it was the United States and China were unable to make mutual concessions to come to an agreement. India was in there, Brazil was in there, but primarily the United States and China were at odds over agricultural liberalization and technology liberalization. It's much more difficult now for the reasons that Professor Petri said, and the stakes are involved, the issues are more complex. I would hope the first step toward improving the international trade order was that we could improve bilateral trade. Let's get past this trade war we're still in. Mm-hmm. Let's try and walk back some of these tariffs that are detrimental to the United States more so than they are to China. And if we can at least restore some degree of bilateral economic cooperation, that might provide the foundation to move to a global perspective. But until we do that, I think it's, whether it's in the WTO, whether it's a regional trade agreement, we're not going to be very successful.
So that's a good point, and I'd like to hear more about our prospects for doing that. One doesn't hear much about walking back the tariffs that were put in place in the trade war. And I certainly haven't heard anything from the Biden administration about that.
So the Biden administration has two things they've said, or not said. They have consistently said the trade war has been a disaster for the United States,
Yeah.
but that the Biden plans to use the tariffs as leverage to reach a new agreement in the context of which we can take away the tariffs.
And did they say what we would be asking China for?
Well, we're back to where we are. IPR,
Yeah.
State-owned enterprises, joint venture laws, these kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
Second thing is, when Biden and the administration has been pressed about the sanctions and will you remove them, they are non-committal. So we don't know now. I mean, we just don't know what they're thinking. There may be some thinking about how we get away from these sanctions, which I think many people still feel are going to be detrimental to a post-COVID economic recovery. So, you know, but that's about where we are, I think.
Okay, I first saw a finger from Professor Lu and then Sean, but Professor, or Xiankun, I guess I should say. Yes.
Yeah, no, two points here. Of course, I mean, more than you, many people are very disappointed about what WTO has not been doing in the past more than 10 years. I mean, since 2001, since 2008, when the Doha failed. I know that you guys are very much frustrated, me equally. But I, as a WTO expert, that I would encourage you to do not, how to say, downplay the importance of the WTO. I mean, the basic structure there is still the very best thing to protect all of us, US, China, others, okay? The second thing is that I understand some other speakers have said that WTO has too many members. We're more than China and the US, so many things cannot happen. But actually, there are some new ways forward. Right now, in the WTO, we have this so-called plurilateral initiatives, where you have less than 164 members of the WTO for something like investment facilitation initiative. You have more than 100 something. E-commerce, you have 80 or 90. Service domestic regulation, you have 62, which covers, I think, 75% of global service trade. And US is not there, but the US is actively participating. So, I mean, there are these kind of new ways that a smaller group of members are trying to do, where others cannot do it. They want to join. The one key element, very key element for this plurilateral, so a smaller number of members, but the process and the result is going to be open for others. In two senses. First thing is that most of the negotiating, I think almost all of them, are going to be applied on an MFN basis. So which means that even we have 63 members, we have done this, we're going to give the benefits to all the others who are not participating. The second thing is that whenever the others think they are ready, they want to join the process, negotiate, and then they can. So I think in the WTO, we still have hope. We still have trying to be innovative to go forward. The second thing is that I think we are probably coming a little bit to the next question about this, whether trade could save us or not. I think, of course, between China and US and between China and others, we talk about strategic competition. We talk about other things, political things, technology competition, so on and so forth. The thing is that I think in Alaska, the US State Secretary Blinken has made a very good characterization of the China-US relationship. He said that the relationship should be as competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. Okay, so I like that characterization, and I immediately say, "Oh, that's a cool characterization." I mean, cool doesn't because Mr. Blinken was eloquent in trying to define the relationship. But also, I mean that the definition is very cool-headed. I think it really defines probably for the next 10 or 15 years or even longer, the China-US relationship. So coming back to what I want to say is that trade must be mostly in the sector of collaborative when it can be. The competition part, be it mean competitive or even adversarial, it should be put on the framework in a non-zero-sum game manner. And so that's where trade cannot save everything, but trade can help many things on other competitive and adversary, political consideration, geopolitical consideration, and even strategic competition. Trade can play a role to help cool people down, to move things forward in a framework. So I think that's what I want to say.
Okay, thank you. Sean?
I was just going to add something about the existing phase 1 and non-phase 2 trade agreements that are part of what we have right now. And, we touched on this earlier, but so the phase 1 agreement, China agreed to buy $200 billion worth of goods above what they had been buying in 2017 over a 2-year period. And it's kind of odd because they could have had that deal 9 months earlier. The agreement also opened up financial services somewhat, but China was already committed and on the path to opening up its financial services market. So that wasn't really new. And it's been within the power of the government and the party to buy more any time they want. But they did put more power in the hands of the government and the state-owned enterprises, as we said earlier. So it was kind of a status model on the part of the US. But then it ran off the rails, not because of any lack of ill faith, I don't think. We ran into COVID. And, energy demand went down and China couldn't buy as much. There's no point buying as much energy as they had committed to. And trade was disrupted. And so phase 1, I don't think for anybody's fault, hasn't really delivered what it was supposed to. And they never got to phase 2 because that was the hardest thing of all. That involved systemic issues in China that really go to the core of China's economic strategy. And that was put aside. So I guess the question is now, what do we do with the phase 1 agreement? Do we just forget there was ever any conversation about phase 2? Do we just take those off the table as an organizational framework? The trick is that about 3/4 of imports now from China are actually still subject to tariffs, and China has reciprocal tariffs on us still. That's a fact of life, and we don't want those to become permanent. We want to get those off as far as we can. And I think the administration is going to, across the board, look for areas of cooperation where they can find them. But it doesn't want to appear weak in the face of China. And a lot of this is a perception game. And they don't want to be, of course. So I think one of the challenges, I think was said earlier, they're not going to want to take the tariffs off unilaterally. They want it to be seen as part of a negotiated process where both sides are moving together. So who moves first? But the other thing is they're going to be under a lot of pressure to be tough on China. So you have in the Senate, Senator Schumer, who is really hard on China and doing this whole package that's sort of aimed at China, as an adversary. Then you have the Republicans who are already beating up on the administration for being soft on China, which it isn't. It's actually being pretty tough on China. But the Republicans aren't giving them any daylight. They're being, the Biden is being portrayed as being soft on China. So he has to manage the issue domestically. But I agree. I think the background of all, there's sort of a generic lack of trust in the relationship now that colors almost everything. And we need to find areas, even if they're very specific ones, where we can restore mutual trust and confidence and go forward there and start to put a few of these pieces back.
I'm going to ask Peter to speak in just a moment because he put his finger up. But before I do that, I just want, some of our audience might not know this, that this notion of doing Multilateral Agreements has made a number of successes, and they have included ones that had both the US and China. The Information Technology Agreement was one that was achieved for a number of countries, but it included US and China. I mean, it wasn't easy, but they got it. So that is a way forward that has worked in several areas. So I think that's worth mentioning. Now, Peter, what there you go.
Yeah, we're circling around to the end, so I wanted to bring back RCEP for a minute.
Aha, okay.
I think RCEP is very interesting in this sense, that China has, in the context of RCEP, a kind of demonstration model of how it collaborates with other countries in the context of a rule-based system. It could, on the one hand, use this network to essentially bring primarily benefits to itself. It could use, as many of its partners fear, the trade and the relationships that it develops to look for political leverage. Or it could develop the system into the kind of rule-based engagement, kind of mutually beneficial. Many countries that were left out of supply chains now brought into it and playing a larger role in it. It could use it as a kind of development model for a regional trading system. It's basically its choice whether this happens or not. And I hope that people in Beijing, as I'm sure they are, thinking about the opportunities that RCEP creates. And as we were talking about confidence building measures, I mean, we do desperately need in the world, on both sides, confidence building measures so that the kind of current impasse passes. And I'm hoping that RCEP might actually be that in terms of China's broader international trading relations.
Thank you very much. That's a thoughtful. You framed that as though that was maybe a concluding comment, but I'll tell you what I'm going to do. We are nearing the end of our time. I've never been quite clear whether we were stopping at 10 o'clock or 10 after 10, but anyhow, let me go around the group. I will end with Peter in case he wants to say more. Let me start from the person we've heard least from very recently, and that's Professor Ross, and then I will go to Sean, then Xiankun, and then Peter if he wants to speak, to give us a minute or two to tie this all up for our audience. Robert?
Thank you, Professor Deardorff. I have nothing to add. Been a great conversation, so happy to let the next person take my time.
Oh, okay. That sounds like something that would happen on the floor of the Senate, but okay, or the House. Sean?
I actually don't have a lot to add either. I think we covered a lot of territory, and I think there's obviously challenges in discussing trade in a concept that's increasingly wrapped into like geostrategic considerations. But I think it is an area that, in contrast to some of those geostrategic ones, is susceptible to negotiation. We have the formats there for doing it. And I think we need to find, I think there is an opportunity now with the new administration in Washington, despite all the difficulties it's going to face, to start to turn a corner, which will require, I think, political will and good faith and some degree of trust on both sides. But it's not going to be easy at all, given the political environment, but it's an investment we need to do our best efforts to make.
Okay, very good. Xiankun, do you have
briefly, I think what we have discussed nicely includes both China-US bilateral collaboration or confrontation, as well as multilateral engagement. So I think me, as always, a firm believer in a positive sum game between China and US is that I hope Biden administration and Chinese administration could do both things, both bilaterally and multilaterally. Bilaterally, we have not discussed something which is that Trump has done everything to surrogate the bilateral channel. So all the previous structure of dialogue, bilateral contacts, everything was very much cut off, and which was wrong, because unless you sit down and discuss, nothing is going to happen. You don't understand each other. That's where the lack of trust and the lack of political will comes up. So I think that Biden administration and China, starting from Alaska, what they have done, I think they should think about under what kind of a structure, what kind of regularity, and at what level, on what issues, strategic, political, economic, trade, everything together. I think that's going to very much frame the future dialogue between China and US, which will be very important for the interests of beyond these two countries. That first point. The second point is that many things we discuss bilateral between China and US, we have discussed state-owned enterprises, our intellectual property, government intervention, subsidies, data free flow, so on and so forth. All these things can be discussed bilaterally, but it has to be framed into multilateral trading system. So that's where I think that also China and the US could also engage each other in WTO negotiations, be it plurilateral or multilateral, that can work together on that. In Geneva, what I see from many other ambassadors is that unless China and US could agree to anything, we cannot agree to anything. So I think that it has to start from China-US engagement, also in Geneva multilaterally. How many things is things tough for China, but also tough for US and EU and others. Put them together and try and find a way forward. That's what we call is ongoing discussion on WTO reform. So I think that by working together, even with different ideas, different concepts, even with sometimes conflicting ideas, that you should work both bilaterally and multilaterally, engage each other, and that would help much more just the two, but all the others. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Peter, do you have final comments?
Just very briefly, and I don't think I'm covering new ground, but I'm sort of struck by the difficulty of the political circumstances in the United States. And as Professor Lu said, even if you can't agree on a lot, at least you can agree on something, and that represents progress. But in fact, I mean, to some extent, the way I read the American political system right now is agreeing is the problem. That over the last 4 years, we have built up this sense that we cannot agree with China, and that therefore the government is afraid to take steps that might be mutually beneficial. So what does that mean? I mean, I think it means it argues for patience, really. It argues for cooling heads. It argues hopefully for gestures by China or by the United States that are not interpreted as giving in to the other side, but nevertheless take a step back from what has been a kind of awful brink over the last 4 years. And in that respect, I mean, I'm sure that in both capitals, people agree that we will be here many years from now, and we will have to find some way to work together and to coexist, even if we will not be able to agree on all of the dimensions of our politics and our economic ties. So, I mean, there is, I'm confident, some goodwill there deeply in both political systems, or somewhere within both political systems. And we've got to get over this period when agreeing itself is the constraint.
Well, very good. Thank you all for your contributions here. It's striking the difficulties that we have in our political and negotiating interactions with China, even though both countries, and indeed all of the other countries involved as well, we have benefited so much over the last several decades from our interactions with each other. The growth of trade has been hugely beneficial in lowering the cost of living in the United States and the rest of the world, in providing employment and increasing incomes in many parts of the world. It's just remarkable how much we've all benefited by interacting. And then we find ourselves suddenly in this position where we're talking as though we're going to give that all up. And surely we won't. I've got to believe that we won't. Anyhow, I have things I've instructed to end the talk with, and they're very good ones to say. I want to thank everyone who attended our panel discussion today, and especially our 4 panelists. Oh, hello there. Okay. The ideas and the insights that we got today are very inspiring and impressive. They wrote that before they actually heard them, but they knew that it would really be inspiring and impressive. For all the audience, though, I want to say, or actually my backers here want me to say, please take a few minutes to fill out the event survey for this panel. I'm not exactly sure. I guess that's telling you there how to do that. There you go. Yeah. I don't know how to read those things, but I guess my phone probably does. Anyway, it would be extremely helpful for the event organizers for quality control and improvement if you would fill out the survey. I gather there's going to be another panel, but that's going to be shown there. Let me see, what have I got here? Last but not least, oh yeah, there it is. Okay, the 2021 Michigan-China Forum Healthcare Panel. Yeah, there you go. On digital health solutions post-pandemic will be held, probably says it there, on March 27th, 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So please check the Michigan-China Forum official social media account for further information. And again, I just personally want to say thank you to all 4 of the panelists. I very much enjoyed this discussion and learned a great deal from every one of you. I hope we get a chance to do it again sometime. So all of you have a good night or good morning in the case of Professor Chu. Anyway, thank you all, and see you next time we do this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.